My name is Jim Lynch. I'm a professor and chair at the University of Maryland. Prior to that, I was the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is the major collection agency for justice, crime and justice statistics. One of the major data collections of the Bureau of Justice Statistics is the National Crime Victimization Survey. This survey has been ongoing in one form or another since 1973. And so I think it's probably the longest running time series of any victimization survey in the world at this point. That's both good news and bad news. I think that over that period of time, the survey has changed a great deal. I think both methodologically and substantively. I think that for the period about 1973 to about 1986, the survey remained fairly constant. And then in 1986, they introduced a number of changes into the survey to sort of make it better and to keep up with the changes in the crime problem that were going on, even though the survey kept constant. So there were changes in 1986. Then again, those changes were, another series of changes were introduced in 1992. And then now again in 2009, we began another series of changes to adapt to the different demands on the survey. Initially, the survey really focused on the major types of crime, that the same types of crime that the police have emphasized. That is, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, all the common law crimes that the police statistics. Because when the survey was first created, it was created to expose the dark figure of crime. That is to say, those common law crimes where the police, they weren't being reported to the police. There was a great deal of distrust of the police in the late 60s and early 70s in the United States. And so they didn't trust the police statistics. And so they turned to victimization surveys as an alternative way to describe the crime problem. And so for many years, that was the principal purpose of the crime survey, which was to provide data that were not tainted by the police, to be a check on the police. So it was very important for the scope of crime that the survey assessed to be very close to the scope of crime that the police routinely dealt with. And so that was the first epoch of the survey. And then in the mid-'80s, we started a redesign where we began all sorts of investigations about survey methodology and other things that would improve the survey. And that started in around 1980, and it lasted until 1985. And then in 1986, a series of changes were introduced into the survey, which would correct some minor problems that were found in the early years of the survey. So more information on the police, the kind of service the police gave to victims, better classifications of location. So we included questions about what the victim was doing at work. So you could have a school crime rate, a work crime rate, a leisure crime rate. So these were all small changes in the survey to increase the utility of the data, but we still kept pretty close to the same scope of crime and the same general purpose for the survey. In 1992, there was a major change in the survey. There was a lot of criticism. One National Academy of Science report criticizing underreporting in the survey, that the survey was not really screening and eliciting enough mentions. So some crimes were believed to be severely underreported, in particular sexual assault and rape. And so for a number of years, they worked on different queuing strategies for the screening interview within the survey. And in 1992, though, they changed the entire way in which they screened the population to identify victims. It was really called short queue screening, and it was a whole new way of trying to jog the memory of respondents and have them recall and recount more completely. So this was quite a change. It changed the volume of crime by 40%. So when you made those changes to the survey, the victims were able to report 40% more of the crimes that were in scope of the survey. So that was a major fix of the survey, and it produced a lot of knowledge about retrospective surveys that we use even today. So I think those were two big changes. I think many people think of that as a series break, so that without adjustment, you really can't use the full series of the National Crime Survey without adjusting for that break because the methodology was so different. Another change that started around in 1992 and continued is that one of the big criticisms of victimization surveys, especially large victimization surveys that are administered by statistical agencies who pay attention to these things, that there wasn't enough information in the survey. So you could get an estimate of the level of crime, but you didn't have a lot of the information that criminologists would like to investigate that crime. You know, the characteristics of the victim, characteristics of the situation in which the victim and the offender found themselves, the consequences of the event. You know, did they seek services? Did they get services? So all these things that criminologists and people involved in victim services would like to know, it was just too much to put on the survey. And so after 1992, the survey began to do what they called core and supplements, so that they would add a supplement to the core survey. The core survey continued year after year after year in pretty much the same way, but they put on additional questions in a subset of the population. So they have a school crime supplement that's administered only to school children. And then they have workplace supplements, which is administered to anybody who's in the workforce, and asks them about victimization on the job, the characteristics of their workplace, the nature of their interaction with their colleagues. So a lot of information that criminologists and others could use. So there are now many of these, there might be 5 or 6 of these supplements that rotate in and out of the survey every few years. Another supplement that was very important and it marked another change in the survey was, it's called the Police Public Contact Survey. So in the early Clinton administration, which was around 1992, there was a big furor over the police stopping African-American motorists. It's called driving while black. And so it became a big political controversy. And I think in response to that, the victimization survey put an additional supplement on, which actually asked citizens not about their criminal victimization behavior, but asked them about their contact with the police in terms of traffic stops on the street. And so now they collected information. There was much more stops by the police than there were actual victimizations. And so that was very influential in diffusing a very bad situation during that period of time, because as soon as the data from the police public contact came out, the controversy died down, because this was seen as an independent source of information that was not tainted by the police or influenced by the police. So those are now the latest change in the survey, I think, is started in 2009 and 10. So, and this is geared more towards, in part, rebuilding the survey, because the survey had budget cuts from around 1996 to about 2006, and it severely cut the sample and other things. So part of the redesign in 2010 was to rebuild the sample up to its former precision. But at the same time, we undertook a very extensive expansion of the survey, so that we are trying to provide estimates not only for the nation, but for the largest states and the largest cities in the country. So you would have an annual survey, which every 3 years would be able to produce an estimate of crime for the 40 largest cities and the 22 largest states. So ever since the beginning of the survey, there's been complaints that crime is local, but the estimates from the NCVS were national only. So this was an attempt, and this is a very expensive and extensive transformation of the survey. So this has been in play for now 5 years, and we're just beginning to see the results of that. So we'll have an idea as to how well these subnational estimates serve the clients of the survey or the stakeholders. And the last change that's taking place in this era around 2010 is that it's a substantial expansion of the data on victim services. So we had one question for many years. We had one question about whether or not a victim received services or not. We're going to expand that to get a much better idea of the kind of services they received, their satisfaction with those services. So we're trying to expand the victim service component to equal that of the police, so that we'll have a much better view of the kinds of services that the victims get after the crime occurs. So there are a number of other things that have changed over time, but those are the main transitions. So we're in the midst of that last one, and I'm sure that as time goes by, we've already begun to do it. For example, we're going to start to move into different types of crime, like cybercrime, identity theft, which we've already done. So we're going to change away from street crime and start moving into these other areas, because we've had 20 years of low crime rates with respect to street crime. And I think there's much more interest in these other types of crime. So the good news of having a 40-year time series is that you get a lot of good data. The bad news is that you have to continually adapt to try and keep up with the changing nature of the crime problem and the changing nature of the survey research business as well. So.